Her name wasn't on the front door. Her title wasn't senior. Her voice didn't carry across boardrooms, but she noticed. Long before the headlines, long before the chaos, long before anyone else even looked up from their screens, Julia sat in the corner cubicle, far from the glass offices, but closest to the data stream. She was a mid-level risk analyst, the kind of employee who rarely spoke in meetings but never missed a deadline. Her job was to look at patterns, trends, anomalies, and one day the patterns began to break. The spreadsheets she reviewed every morning started to whisper something ugly. Subtle at first, a drift in mortgage bundles that shouldn't have changed. A sequence of early payment defaults clustering in zip codes that weren't high risk. Banks rerouting exposure through shell firms she'd never seen in the logs before. She flagged them. Not dramatically, just little yellow highlights and quiet footnotes in her reports. The replies came back the same. Normal fluctuation, market correction, reallocate and proceed. But she couldn't unsee it. She dug deeper. One weekend, she stayed late, just her and the hum of machines. What she found made her hands go cold. Entire portfolios built on leverage with no verified backing. Debt models being copied and pasted across platforms like templates, and risk scores being manually lowered with no explanation. It was as if the system was preparing to implode, but smiling while it did. She brought it to her supervisor Monday morning. He skimmed the first 2 pages and handed them back. Don't overthink the noise. Just do your part. That night, she couldn't sleep. Not because of the numbers, but because of the silence around them. So she tried again, created a presentation, polished the graphs, added a slide that showed how, if the patterns continued, over 20,000 families would default within 6 months. The meeting was brief. They said she was obsessed, that she needed to trust the models, that maybe she wasn't cut out for high-stress analysis. Her access was restricted the next day. Folders she once had clearance for now flashed red. She was removed from 2 distribution lists. Her desk was moved closer to HR. That was the first time she felt afraid, not for her job, for what they were trying to hide, because the warnings were no longer small, and no one wanted to hear them. Julia didn't want to be a whistleblower. She just wanted someone, anyone, to look at the numbers. So she wrote it down. 33 pages. Tables, timelines, projections. A full internal memo marked confidential, urgent risk review. She sent it to the compliance department, CC'd 2 directors, and even printed 3 physical copies. One she submitted to her manager, one she kept, and one she slid anonymously into the chief risk officer's inbox. Then she waited. Days passed. No reply, no meeting, no acknowledgement. Until one morning, her manager called her in with HR sitting beside him. They didn't reference the report. Instead, they asked about performance alignment, emotional tone in communication, and team cohesion. Julia sat still. They didn't have to say it. She already knew. The report had hit a nerve, not because it was wrong, but because it was right, dangerously right. After that, the atmosphere changed. No one looked her in the eye. Emails slowed. Small conversations stopped when she entered the room. A colleague she'd worked with for 5 years told her quietly by the elevator, "They think you're trying to sink the ship." She replied, "The ship is already sinking." He didn't answer. A week later, Julia received a formal notice. She was being reassigned. Out of risk analysis. Into special projects. The department had no office. No team. Just a password-protected portal with dummy tasks that went nowhere. It was exile in plain sight. She tried to access her own report again. Deleted. She checked the print copy she'd submitted to her manager. Gone. When she asked about it, he replied, "I don't recall receiving anything like that." She went to the compliance officer, who looked at her with forced neutrality and said, "We didn't find anything actionable in the materials provided." She asked, "Did you read it?" He smiled. That's not how the process works. So she checked the last copy, the one she'd kept for herself. Still intact, still time-stamped, still clear. It wasn't paranoia anymore. It was erasure. Someone, maybe more than one, had made the decision to bury the warning. Not because they didn't believe it, but because they did. And that made it dangerous. For weeks, she sat in her special projects cubicle, watching the system pretend stability while the cracks beneath it widened. She watched news headlines turn cheerful, watched execs speak at conferences about robust growth, watched her old team present doctored models with falsified projections. She wasn't scared anymore. She was furious. They hadn't ignored the warning. They had shredded it. It began like a crack in glass, too small to notice, too late to stop. A regional lender folded. Then a mortgage insurer declared temporary restructuring. Then foreclosures spiked, first in the same zip codes she had circled months ago. Julia watched the headlines like déjà vu. Everything she projected was unfolding, not near it. Not close, exact, the same sequence of defaults. The same cascading losses through bundled securities. The same exposure paths she had diagrammed, right down to the calendar week. Except now, the damage was real, flesh and bone. Families evicted, retirement accounts frozen, phone lines at the unemployment office crashing from volume. She sat in her silent cubicle, screen dim, watching the company's homepage change from "Trusted for generations" to "We re in this together." The CEO went on TV, called it unforeseeable, said the firm was blindsided, pledged to cooperate fully with investigations. Julia almost laughed, because in her locked desk drawer sat the printout. Her report, dated, detailed, ignored. One morning, she passed her old supervisor in the hallway. He avoided eye contact, but she stopped him. "You remember the report?" He shook his head. She didn't press. Because denial was the only thing left, he had to protect himself. The same day, she received a calendar invite. Mandatory meeting, executive level, marked urgent. In the conference room, she was surprised by the faces. Legal, PR, external consultants, and the chief risk officer, who greeted her like an old friend. "We know you've done analysis on this. We're pulling together internal reviews." She blinked. "Now you want my analysis?" He smiled. "It's not about blame. It's about solutions." She laughed once, dry, involuntary. "You already had the solution," she said. "You just deleted it." A PR advisor leaned forward. "If we frame this correctly, your perspective could be helpful." It was the same playbook. Turn the truth into a press strategy. Rebrand the warnings as deep concern. She stood up. "You're not trying to fix it. You're trying to survive it." The room fell quiet. She left. No one followed. That night, as she walked home through streets darker than usual, past shuttered stores and ATM machines flashing red, she realized something brutal. They weren't wrong. They would survive this, because they'd chosen who wouldn't. And Julia, she'd seen it all coming. Every name, every number, every silence. They stood behind podiums. They sat before cameras. They issued statements filled with grief and distance. No one could have predicted this. This was a once-in-a-generation event. "We are all victims of systemic failure." Julia didn't shout. She didn't tweet, didn't leak. But she watched. She watched the executives testify under oath. Clean suits, calm voices, while whole neighborhoods packed their lives into boxes. She watched headlines shift blame. Consumer overextension, unexpected market fragility, irresponsible lending. She watched as people who had no access to risk models, who had no voice in boardrooms, were painted as the architects of their own ruin. And through it all, she held on to one thing: the emails. Not just hers, but the forwarded ones, the copies she made. The threads where decisions were made, Phrases were chosen carefully. Too early to act. Need to protect investor confidence. Push review to Q3. Optics aren't ideal. It wasn't incompetence. It was delay. A calculated choice to wait until collapse was inevitable, and then frame it as unavoidable. She printed them all, stored them in a binder marked with one word, WHEN, because she knew the day would come. The day someone knocked on her door. The day investigators actually wanted the truth. The day denial no longer served those at the top. Until then, she stayed silent. Not because she was afraid, because she wanted timing to be undeniable. She passed foreclosure signs like tombstones, saw a family she recognized sleeping in their car behind a grocery store. She didn't tell them she tried, that she'd warned them, not directly, but upstream, that their lives were collateral for quarterly targets. Instead, she left the blanket, quietly, and went home. The binder still sat on her shelf, untouched, unshredded, ready, because while they called it unforeseeable, she held the receipts. In the months that followed, the firm downsized. Some resigned quietly. Others vanished from press releases overnight. A few reinvented themselves as thought leaders, writing op-eds on resilience and recovery. They never mentioned her, never acknowledged the warnings, never took responsibility, and slowly the world moved on. But Julia didn't. She still had the binder, still had the timelines, still had the truth, mapped, archived, undeniable. Sometimes she wondered what would have happened if they'd listened, if they'd paused, if they'd chosen caution over quarterly earnings. But deep down she knew they hadn't missed the signals. They had buried them, because acknowledging the truth would have meant slowing the machine. And machines don't stop for humans. One evening, she stood across the street from the building where it all began, where she used to clock in, unnoticed, invisible. The logo had changed. New name, same foundation. She watched executives in new suits leave through the lobby, laughing, phones glowing with the next opportunity. They had erased her from the system, but they couldn't erase what she carried. Because in a world built on silence, memory is resistance. And she remembers everything, the data, the faces, the dismissals, the consequences. They disappeared. But she didn't. She's still here. And one day, when the world asks again, why didn't anyone warn us? She'll open the binder and answer with the truth they tried to erase.